Welcome to YO Today. I'm Paul Peppis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Nina Amstutz, Associate Professor of the History of Art and Architecture at the University of Oregon. Her book, Caspar David Friedrich, Nature and the Self, from Yale University Press in 2020, won the Novalis Prize from the Novalis Gesellschaft, Friedrich Schiller University, Jena, and was a finalist for the Waterloo Center for German Studies Book Prize and the Klaus Heine Prize from the Goethe University in Frankfurt. Professor Amstutz, along with Portland artist and activist Cleo Davis, curated the exhibition Policing Justice, which is on view at the Portland Institute for Contemporary Art through May 19th, 2024. Thanks so much for coming on the show, Nina. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
So first, let's just go back. Why'd you become an art history person? Well, how'd you get there?
You know, that's a great question. I think I had the good fortune in high school of having an art teacher who taught some art history, Mrs. Egger. And I also, my family's actually Swiss, and I spent my last year of high school in Switzerland and had the benefit also of traveling around a lot as I was learning about art. And then when I went to university, I took some electives. I didn't really know that was a career choice at that point. My family isn't particularly academic, but it just ended up becoming my major, and I think the rest is history.
The rest is art history.
Art history, exactly.
So in your scholarly work on your first book, your focus has been on issues surrounding landscape, nature, animal studies, and the history of science. So why did those subfields, why were you drawn to them?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've always been fascinated by the relationship between art and nature. And that's something you can explore in a variety of ways, and landscape is one of those ways. Animal studies is another one of those ways. And certainly I think a lot of my research has followed that sort of thread in different forms. With respect to the history of science, the older you get, the more you realize there are so many other great careers. And I think I also in another lifetime might have been a scientist. And so I think I scratched that itch a little bit by exploring the history of science. And I think with that comes to an interest just in the ways in which knowledge is culturally constructed and always historically specific, and seeking to understand how knowledge manifests in a variety of different contexts and disciplines. Science is always a great access point to that.
So you are officially a historian of 18th and 19th century British and German art. Yet, as I've mentioned, you've co-curated this exhibit at Pica called Policing Justice. So if I were to look at your CV and see that what you've done as a scholar, I would not have predicted that you would have done that. So how'd you get there? What led you to that project?
Yeah, well, I think, maybe various things might have contributed. Certainly, I live half-time in Portland with my husband, and I was in Portland during 2020. And I was struck by not only the tremendous sort of outpouring for support for the racial justice movement in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, but also the staggering amount of police violence that those protesters confronted. And that was actually more than anywhere else in Portland, Oregon. The protests lasted longer, and they were met with more use of force than anywhere else. And I really wanted to understand that. I think as a historian, my interest in the present is always somehow through the lens of the past. And so, that kind of flare-up of violence doesn't come out of nowhere. And so I think I used my good fortune of being a professor and having time for research towards investigating this particular history behind what happened in Portland. So there's the just kind of, I think, responding to the present moment dimension of the project. There's also the personal dimension, I guess. I'm married to someone who works in criminal justice reform, and so I think just in our time together, I've done a real deep dive into issues surrounding criminal justice and learned a tremendous amount from him and all of the people in our kind of orbit. And so although that's not in my profile necessarily, it's sort of where the personal intersects with the academic. And then, the last thing I would mention, which is also deeply personal, it doesn't have to do with police violence per se, but it has to do with my own kind of history here, and that is that I immigrated to the United States, officially, I guess, in 2018, it was a strange time to immigrate here, a lot of divisive politics, to say the very least. And, I felt very alienated by what I was seeing, and then that really exacerbated, I think, in 2020. And so I, over the course of kind of creating this exhibition, I also applied for citizenship, and actually last September I naturalized as an American citizen, and it felt, I think, really important to me to find a way to engage with my community in a meaningful way and really kind of understand the history behind it in order to become a citizen of this country. And I think, many of us find ourselves not necessarily always agreeing with what we're seeing around us, and there are a lot of different ways to participate in democracy. And I think for me, I needed to do that in a way that felt organic or natural to me. And of course, as an art historian, making an exhibition about that sort of personal journey in a way, or intellectual journey, how those two things intersect was at the heart of why I undertook this project.
So your co-curator is Cleo Davis.
Yeah.
So first of all, tell us who that is, what we need to know about Cleo, but also how did you come to collaborate with him?
So I met Cleo actually through an architecture faculty member at the U of O. Cleo and his wife Kane had been Design for Spatial Justice Fellows here at the U of O, and so they do have a University of Oregon connection. And I first learned about him when I had already initiated the project, and I was looking for local artists to take on commissions that deal with the history of policing from different perspectives. And a lot of Cleo and Kane's work was really about urban planning and its local relationship to systemic racism. And so they felt like a really kind of ideal pair, actually, to engage as artists for this show, to look at a variety of issues related to urban planning as they intersect with policing. So that's Cleo. So he's very much a social construct artist and has sort of a deep practice that's also very archival and research-based. And then over time, as we got to know each other better, we had really sort of deep conversations about policing and what that really means. And I think he became really central to the ideation of the show, and really expanded my thinking about what policing means. Policing, as he has taught me, is really just the most extreme form of enforcement, really, among a host of other forms of enforcement that are maybe they don't manifest directly through police, but they're there, whether it's through public policy or what have you. And so, yeah, he became a sort of central force, and it felt organic at some point, especially given his deep connection to Portland and the Black community there, to curate the show together.
So can you give us a sense of the goals that the two of you had for the show, like what you were hoping it would do for people, what you were hoping people would take from it?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of different things, and it is a show for everyone, really, and so it means different things to different people. I think, from my perspective as an academic, I was certainly interested in making sure that we're telling a variety of histories of policing, and that those histories be told from lived experiences, and so certainly very, very local focus, and histories that, if you flip the script, if you will, with respect to policing, a lot of the ways in which policing is discussed in our society is through the police themselves. The way in which crime is reported and what have you is usually through a police report, and that police report goes directly to the media, and that is the story that then sort of shapes public understandings of what happened. And that doesn't always align so clearly with the lived experience of those involved. And so we wanted to make sure that certainly the history of policing was told from those perspectives of people most impacted. So there's the historical dimension, and again, as the historian, I always feel that to understand the present, you have to understand the past. And then we also wanted to really take stock of what had happened since 2020, and so there have been all sorts of different initiatives with respect to police reform, and some of those are ongoing. There have been a number of lawsuits as well that have been settled, and then there have also been ways in which some of the major reforms have been rolled back or not so subtly undermined as well. And so we wanted to have an opportunity to really talk in a kind of public space about where things are at, what still needs to change. And then Cleo, certainly, I think one of his important contributions is the futurist dimension. We can't just focus on the past. We have to imagine what our society might look like if we actually were to reimagine the way that public safety looks. And so there is also a really important dimension of looking forward, and that's been very much present in the programming as well. A focus on restorative justice, Black governance, and a variety of different kind of creative imaginings. And that, of course, that's also where art can really play a role. Artists can't change policy necessarily, but they can show us through creative imagining what another future might look like.
Incredible. So let's talk a little bit about some of the artists and the groups that contributed. So first, Cleo Davis is a member of the Black Aesthetic Studio. So tell us about the Black Aesthetic Studio and what their role was.
Yeah, and so actually after I asked Cleo and Cain to participate in the show, the kind of spirit of all the commissions was that the lead artists, or the artists that at least were initially contacted or found, would find their own collaborators. And so they, in their project, formed the Black Aesthetic Studio, which is a relatively new entity. This is their first exhibition, and that is a collaboration between the two of them, as well as Robert Clark, who was actually another Design for Spatial Justice fellow at University of Oregon, and then got a job as an architecture professor at Cal Poly Pomona, sorry. And so he's there now. And then the fourth member of their group is Kimberly Moreland, she has a background in historic preservation and is a consultant in Portland. And she's also the president of the Oregon Black Pioneers, which is a local Black history organization that does have a lot of experience as well putting on exhibitions. And so the four of them together formed this entity and undertook this project together. And so I guess we'll see what their next project is, or where their future lands them as a collaborative. But yeah, that's the history.
So why was it important to have the exhibit in Portland?
That's a great question. This exhibition really could be anywhere. And I think there are a lot of artists since 2020 especially that have focused their practice on issues surrounding policing and police violence. I think for myself at least, and for Cleo, we are in Portland a lot. And so in order to kind of grapple really closely with any kind of situated history, you need to sort of focus on the context that you're in. So I think there's just the kind of practical dimension of being there. Of course, as I said, Portland is a kind of unique case in the context of the George Floyd protests, and that the protests did last so long and were met with such a staggering amount of violence that it felt particularly important to unpack that. And I think it doesn't align very closely with how a lot of people imagine Oregon. Oregon is known at least to be a pretty progressive state. It's also a mostly white state, and so how did that come to be? And the part of our history that still I think many Oregonians don't know is that although Oregon was never a slave state, it did have Black exclusion laws, and it's also a settler state, of course. So there is a violent history there that is deeply racist, and that absolutely intersects with the history of policing here. And so those are, I think, the kind of main reasons. But I would also add that just policing is something that is very local in itself in terms of how it's governed and funded. And so in most cases, city councils and mayors are the ones that run the police and fund the police and determine budgets and all of that. So if you want to imagine police accountability and police reform, the place to start is local. It's not at a national level whatsoever.
So let's talk about some of the work that's in the show.
Sure.
So tell us first about the collaborative installation Mapping the Pipeline by master artists Michael Bernard, Stevenson Jr., and Blue. Tell us about that piece.
Yeah, so Michael was sort of brought on initially as an artist to tell the story of the intersection of policing and youth in the city. And again, in the spirit of collaboration that is this show, they were asked to find their own collaborators, and Blue is somebody who Michael has worked with a fair amount before. Blue is a formerly incarcerated artist, and they know each other, I think, through the context of working with formerly incarcerated and incarcerated artists now. So Michael also does a lot of work at Columbia River Correctional Facility, which is a local prison in Portland. Michael also has worked a lot with youth, and again, that's why they were chosen. They do a lot of school programs in a variety of schools in the Albina area, mostly black schools. And the kind of programming that they do is exactly sort of what we were imagining would speak to potentially a commission in this area. And so the project that they came up with is a set of 5 tables called Mapping the Pipeline, and it actually sort of maps the school-to-prison pipeline in Oregon, or in Portland. And one of the tables is the Cottonwood School, which is a school that's actually adjacent to the ICE facility in Portland. And during the 2020 protests, protesters were in front of that building. A lot of tear gas was used against those protesters, which then impacted the local school. Of course, the school went on lockdown, and the soil was found to be contaminated with the gas. And so that's the sort of first table. And then he has, or they have 3 other schools: the Martin Luther King Jr. Elementary School, the Harriet Tubman Middle School, and the Jefferson High School. And all these schools are actually created, or all these maps, if you will, they're kind of tabletops with a variety of little models on them that kind of situate you in the neighborhood. Those buildings are also created with kids, and so Michael worked with kids and taught them how to use SketchUp, and then they printed these 3D models of the schools. And so although the actual kind of mapping of the pipeline sort of suggests something a little bit negative in a way, the making of the whole project was about teaching kids how to do things that are actually quite practical, engaging them in the art making process, and that's very much in the spirit of the work that Michael does more broadly. It's actually sort of interrupting the pipeline before it happens.
So you mentioned the tear gas, and that brings me to ask you to tell me about the installation piece by the British research agency Forensic Architecture, which is very powerful. I mean, all the pieces in the show are very powerful, but this is one that I found especially striking. Say a little bit about it.
Yeah, so that's actually the kind of origin in a way of the exhibition. And so when I first sort of was thinking about what this might be, the idea was to contact Forensic Architecture and see if they might be interested in undertaking an investigation into tear gas in Portland. And the reason that they would be suitable for that is that they have done a lot of investigations into, well, really a variety of human rights violations around the world, but a lot of them have to do with chemical weapons. And it seemed like, given what happened in Portland, and just the sheer amount of tear gas that was used against protesters, that it might be a way for them to both sort of pursue their larger goal of seeking national and international bans on tear gas, and also for us locally to potentially find ways of impacting public policy through really intensive research and documentation. I'm sorry to say that has not happened, but nonetheless, they did produce a very, very powerful study of Tear Gas Tuesday, which was one particularly egregious day in June of 2020. And they found that through their sort of simulation, and I want to emphasize it is a simulation, we can't measure this with any exactitude, but their research involves actually looking at public records of the kind of munitions and how many munitions were used. It looks at, or involves looking at weather patterns, the physical or geographical locations, and also video footage from really kind of crowdsourced video footage. And they found that the amount of tear gas that was used against protesters in particular places ranged from anywhere from sort of 60 to 2,000 times the amount that is safe for human exposure. So really shocking statistics, not a big surprise in a way, given the kind of testimony that folks were describing who were there. But nonetheless, it felt meaningful to have that research sort of brought together. And so that really was how the project started, engaging them, and they've worked on that for a good 2 years, sort of gradually. And then building an exhibition around that. Their work is also always in collaboration with local organizations, and so they work closely with Don't Shoot Portland, as well as other local activists, including Juniper Simonis, who had collected a bunch of munitions and who is a chemist, and some professors as well here. So,
yeah, all of it is incredible. So, how's the public responded to the exhibit?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think for the most part, it's been a really powerful and meaningful exhibition. I mean, I can't speak for everyone, obviously. I more can speak about the sort of stories that I've heard. I think it's been really meaningful for some of the individuals whose stories have been told in the show. There is a memorial dimension as well for some victims of police violence. And the space itself has been opened up, I think, in many ways to a broader community. PICA has always been a very kind of open space in terms of how welcoming it is, but not everyone necessarily regularly goes to art exhibitions, and certainly our opening had record attendance and lots of people who had never been there before. So I think it brought in a lot of audiences and has led to a lot of really generative conversations. I mean, we also had a lot of really rich programming, which brought people in and kind of revived some of the conversations surrounding accountability that started in 2020 and feel unresolved for a variety of reasons.
Say a little bit about those programs. Tell us about some of them.
Yeah, so I guess some of the biggest ones, we had an artist panel which involved some of the out-of-town artists sort of right after the opening. That was a really meaningful conversation that was led by Mac Smith, who is also actually a contributor to the show in some ways. He wrote an essay in our brochure that really speaks to sort of the ways in which the protests in 2020 opened up sort of new imaginings for a more just future. So he led the conversation. He's an activist and local journalist. Then we had a symposium which was less artist focused and really was a kind of forum for really three conversations: the conversation about our history and how we got to 2020, and then a conversation about some of the initiatives that came out of 2020 and where they're at, and then a futures panel that was really oriented again around restorative justice and finding alternatives to policing. And so that was a really meaningful event that also had, I'm running a blank here about our keynote speaker. Sorry, it'll come back to me. Alex Vitale, who's an important policing scholar at Brooklyn College at CUNY. And yeah, we've had a film series which also involved the our first public screening of Reimagining Safety, a film by Matthew Solomon. And so that was really powerful, and that was coupled with a short by Corey Elia, who's a local student filmmaker who had documented a lot of the 2020 protests and sort of narrates a history of policing through that imagery. And then, we've still got one more event for anyone who watches this before the end of the exhibition. On April 27th, we've got a podcast launch for a podcast by Aaron Yankee and Jody Darby that is about sort of the healthcare alternatives that evolved through the protests. And they're particularly interviewing the Black Cross Healthcare Collective, which was a group that found sort of ways of treating people who had been exposed to tear gas without going to the hospital.
So you also brought some of these guests to speak at U of O. Tell us a little bit about those events.
Yeah, and so three of the more national artists that participated came to U of O. So we had Sandy Rodriguez, who's a Los Angeles-based Chicana artist, and she contributed work to the exhibition that relates closely to tear gas. She creates these incredible maps that are sort of in a pre-Columbian style, if you will, and all painted with handmade materials. She makes all her own pigments, which is pretty amazing. And all these maps sort of are overlaid with contemporary social concerns or issues. And so this particular map she contributed was a map related to tear gas, and that documents sort of all the different cities in America that had gassed protesters in 2020. So she came and talked about her work, which was really wonderful. We had Alfredo Jar. He's probably the most famous artist that's in the exhibition. He's been around for a long time and has been doing really important work really around the world that deals with human rights crises. And he gave a very powerful lecture. And then we had Robert Trafford, who is a member of Forensic Architecture and was the project lead on the Portland investigations. And so he spoke about some of their larger work and how they go about their research, as well as looking sort of very closely at the Portland investigations.
And you also had a course that you taught called Making the Exhibit. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so whenever you're doing something as a faculty member that is sort of coming to fruition, it's nice to engage students in that in whatever way you can. And so I designed a class called Making the Exhibition, Policing Justice. And it was a very practical class. It was a class about how to curate a show in a kind of collaborative, community-based and local way. So we used policing justice as a kind of case study, but we also looked at other exhibitions, and the students were asked to really throughout the term work on one major project collaboratively. And so they formed different groups and they created mock exhibitions about social issues that they felt were important to them. Self-selected. And the class involved a lot of different guest speakers. I mean, I think just because of all the people that were involved in the making of the exhibition, I was able to recruit them all as guest speakers. We had Kristen Kennedy and Erte de Garces, who were our partners at PICA for this exhibition. They came and talked about exhibition design and project management. We had someone come and talk about budgets. We had Don't Shoot Portland talk about Teresa Rayford, who's the founder, came and talked about her work liberating the archive and what it means to engage community with archival material. And then Cleo and Kane also came and talked about the ways in which an art practice can really engage public policy. And so it was really fruitful. And the students in this class, they really, were asked to do kind of every meaningful step other than stage the actual exhibition. And so they wrote exhibition proposals that they would be pitching to some, institution. They created a budget for their project. They created a grant application. They applied for a Creative Heights application, which is a big Oregon grant. They also designed the space and wrote a brochure and sort of then presented their final projects. And so
sounds like an amazing course.
It was an amazing class, yeah. I mean, I've never taught anything quite like it. Hopefully I'll have the context to kind of reimagine it in some way without, this one big case study. But yeah, it was fruitful.
So Nina, this will be our last question. What's going to happen next for you in relation to this kind of work?
Yeah, that's a big question that I don't know if I have a good answer to it. I mean, I think there's still a month or so left of the exhibition, and so I'm still kind of just absorbing it and in it in a way. I have put a big book project really on hold for the past year as this project has amped up. So I'm looking forward to getting back to that a little bit and returning to some of my other research. But obviously I've opened a whole new kettle of fish, and so I think time will tell. I'm not sure I have an answer to that yet.
Okay, well, good luck with that.
Thank you.
Very important kettle of fish that you've opened, and I should say I've seen the show, and I hope everyone who sees this video will go to see it. I think every citizen in the state of Oregon should see that show.
Those are very kind words. Thank you. I hope that happens. That would be wonderful.
So thank you, Nina, for talking with us today. It's really been a pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
I've been speaking with Nina Amstutz, Associate Professor of the History of Art and Architecture at the University of Oregon. She and Portland artist Cleo Davis curated the exhibition Policing Justice, which is on view at the Portland Institute for Contemporary Art through May 19th, 2024. Thanks so much for watching.